Hi there, and welcome to Strangers in a Straight Land, a podcast of queer spoken word. Heaven. The truth runs wild, like a tear down a cheek. Trying to save face and daddy heartbreak, I'm lying through my teeth. This voice inside has been eating at me, trying to replace the love that I fake with what we both need. The truth runs wild, like kids on concrete, trying to sedate my mind in its cage and numb what I see. Awake, wide-eyed, I'm screaming at me, trying to keep faith and picture his face staring up at me. Without losing a piece of me, how do I get to heaven? Without changing a part of me, how do I get to heaven? All my time is wasted, feeling like my heart's mistaken. Oh, so if I'm losing a piece of me, maybe I don't want heaven. The truth runs wild, like the rain to the sea, trying to set straight the lines that I trace to find some relief. This voice inside has been eating at me, trying to embrace the picture I paint and color me free. Without losing a piece of me, how do I get to heaven? Without changing a part of me, how do I get to heaven? All my time is wasted, feeling like my heart's mistaken. So if I'm losing a piece of me, maybe I don't want heaven. Those are the lyrics from a song by Troye Sivan, who's an Australian artist, released on his debut album Blue Neighborhood in 2015. I started by reciting the lyrics of that song today because his album was really impactful to me when it came out. Troye is a gay artist, and one of probably, I think, the most popular gay artists of the time. We didn't have many young gay pop artists coming up that were mainstream, and he definitely rose to fame pretty fast, I think from YouTube. But in this album, Blue Neighborhood, the theme kind of throughout the album is him struggling with his sexuality. They have a 3-part music video I really recommend you all look up, with his song Wild, which was his debut single that was in the top of the charts, along with 2 of the other songs from that album. Basically, the video shows a really sad, kind of beautiful love story, though, where he falls in love with his best friend growing up, but his best friend's dad is homophobic and angry, and his friend won't be in a relationship with him because of that, and he leaves him and starts dating a girl and living a lie, basically. And you just see Troye sad watching all this happen and reflecting on it, and really brings out kind of like the heart of the album, I think, which is just that, the struggles of growing up queer, especially in a conservative or religious context. But this song in particular, Heaven, was one of those songs that I played on loop for a long time. I don't know if you've ever had those songs before that just really speak to you in some way, that, I don't know, touch a deep part of you, that expresses some emotion that you just couldn't express yourself, and helps you process that. I think that's why music is so special for so many of us. And I know I hear reports all the time from artists who say that, people talk to them about their song and say, oh, this song saved my life, or this song meant so much to me for such and such reason. So I don't think this is uncommon. I think music is very special for that, both for the lyrics as well as the melody. Sometimes just a melody can be meaningful to us, but of course, very often too, the lyrics. And there's something different too about lyrics when they're sung to lyrics when they're spoken. Not better or worse, but sometimes they just touch us in a way that something about it being put to music allows the words to express emotion in a stronger way, or at least a different way than they can when they're just spoken. In any case, the song was really important to me, like I said, and it came out in 2015. I very rarely buy a whole album of an artist. I've only done it a couple times. Adele was the first time. But Troye Sivan's album, Blue Neighborhood, was the other time. I listened to one song and immediately bought the whole album. And it was because, I resonated very much with the themes he was talking about. It felt in many ways like my own life. I don't think I've ever heard an album or listened to an artist who seemed to understand exactly my experience in the way that Troye does. And so in 2015, when this album came out, it inspired one of my favorite poems I've ever written, which I'm going to talk about today. It's a 3-part poem, so it's almost kind of like 3 poems in one, and I named it Blue Neighborhood after this album. There's a couple themes that he touches on in his album through the songs. Like I mentioned, one of them was kind of struggling with his sexual identity, and then falling in love and the kind of confused feelings that come around with that. But in particular, I think he must have experienced some of the same things I had to go through coming from a very Christian home. I grew up going to church twice a week, Sundays for regular service, and then Wednesday night for youth group, and then generally a third night a week as well for small groups when I was in middle school and high school. And even when I was in university, as I mentioned last week, a third night a week for small group Bible study as well. So obviously religion was a huge part of my life growing up. I had been told for most of my life that being gay was wrong and evil and sinful, and that you just had to not do that. So I spent 10 years of my life from age 12 around till 22 when I finally realized that suppressing my sexuality or trying not to be gay would eventually kill me. And I chose life and happiness and to accept and love myself, and had to realize that Christianity or the things I had believed my whole life or had been told were incompatible with a happy life. And it was very difficult for me, obviously, because I really believed it. I had believed it my whole life, and I went through a crisis of faith and existential dread. Eventually had to make decisions about what I would do or who I would be or what I would believe. That was really personified in this song, Heaven. And I think Troye, in the same way, expresses that kind of journey of being kind of eaten from the inside out, of struggling with your perceptions of self, and trying to save face, he says, and daddy heartbreak, lying through my teeth. This idea that you're trying to wear the mask and save face and please those around you by doing what they say is right. But he says, this voice inside has been eating at me, trying to replace the love that I fake with what we both need. And this idea that the life on the outside, or the life that was placed upon you, is incompatible with the truth that you experience on the inside, and how to rectify that, how to deal with that. It kind of comes back to him repeating through the chorus, or struggling with this idea that how do you get to heaven without losing a piece of you that. And I think it's him kind of talking about this idea that, obviously in Christianity, they tell us that this is wrong and sinful, and that, if you are gay, you'll go to hell. But, like we talked about last week, this idea that there's a different standard held for, say, queer people who are asked to sacrifice everything about themselves, while those in the rest of the church don't have to sacrifice really anything. They go through the steps or the motions, but they don't actually have to give up anything. But the struggle that those of us who are queer in Christianity have to address, we're asked to basically lose a piece of who we are, or change ourselves to get to heaven, in a sense, whether it be the literal heaven or maybe a more metaphorical idea of happiness or contentment or completion. And it goes very strongly with what I was talking about, this idea that I realized I could not be happy, or I would never be happy, if I continued to try to deny or suppress or change this aspect of me to do what others told me I had to do to be righteous. And in the end, you get to a point where you have to look at that and say, am I willing to lose this part of me? Am I willing to kill myself, but either metaphorically or for many quite literally, to get to what they call heaven? Eventually, I came to the place where I realized that there was no happiness or joy. I would never be happy, perhaps, or at least I feared I would never be happy, no matter how hard I tried, or no matter if I did all the right things or worked harder than everyone else I knew to deny myself to be righteous. But in the end, what was it really for? And was it really what I was supposed to do, or is it merely just what others were telling me I had to do? That really sent me obviously into a crisis of faith and identity, and in the end, I had to walk away because I knew if I kept going, I would kill myself. And that was just the reality of the situation. I still struggle with that idea constantly. I still have moments of my life where, even though I disagree with the beliefs that many Christians hold, that being homosexual is incompatible with being a Christian person or being loved by God or being righteous, I still doubt in many of my darkest moments that I'm wrong and that I don't know. I don't even know if I believe in God still, or if I believe that heaven is real. I'm not sure. I accept the possibility of heaven or God, but I'm not sure what it means, or if it looks like what Christians think it looks like. But what I do know is that it is killing queer kids all over the world. That whether God is real or Christianity is right, their beliefs are actively killing children, young queer people all over, and adults as well too. And I knew that if I continued to try to be a part of that community that said they accepted me, but at the same time gaslit, abused, and ultimately rejected me, that I would be one of those people. And so all of that, this album, which I highly recommend you listen to, it's really quite beautiful, especially the song Heaven. But that album basically instructed this poem I'm going to share with you today, which I named kind of in its honor. Well, not kind of in its honor, in its honor. Like I said before, it's in 3 parts, so it's kind of like 3 poems in one. The first explores that process of basically growing up in Christian world as a queer person, the feeling of having to wear a mask and hide and pretend and fit in and try not to stand out as that stranger in a straight land. The second part talks more about the experience of depression and feeling lost and helpless and trapped within a world you can't escape, trying to get to heaven that you just know you'll never be able to reach. Then the third is very personal, and it explores more my own specific experience. In the church I grew up with, and once you're in junior high and high school, you're put into small groups that we called core groups, with a core group leader who was generally a college age or 20s, but sometimes older adults as well too. Just a mentor figure who was with your group of your peers. I think probably 8 to 12, either young men or young women, since they were gender specific, that you spent all your time with, both at church on Wednesday night youth group and did things outside of as well. They were kind of your support group and your friend group and pretty much, your family in church. In junior high, my core group leader was probably the most popular one. He was a very charismatic young man, probably in his early 20s. Everybody loved him. He was kind of like the ideal core group leader. Everybody was very jealous that we had him. But as often the case in Christian communities, as well as pretty much any human community, the most popular, the charismatic, the handsome, lovable face of the popular ones often hide people that are abusive or manipulative or selfish. And that charisma, that attention-seeking is really a guise by which they get attention they need or desire or want, or they enjoy having power over others. In any case, without getting into too much detail, I was abused by this church leader. This kind of started the beginning of a very long and sad chapter of my life, a not so happy way to start an experience which was already going to be hard enough because I was coming to grips with the fact that I knew I was attracted to boys, but right at the outset of it, I also had to suffer through abuse from a trusted and loved mentor figure, male mentor figure, which really made that whole journey a lot more difficult. So I explore that as well. I'm going to read Blue Neighborhood now for you. And as always, they will also be available on the podcast individually if you want to listen to them again. Blue Neighborhood 1. We wear our masks like face-hugging aliens, praying they will impregnate us. Strangers in a straight land who awkwardly imitate casual inferences, masculine affectations, lower the voice, tilt the head, make sports references. We live among them, refugees fleeing Christian wombs, lifetimes spent conforming, endeavoring to not embarrass parents who parade us through church youth groups like a geisha, quiet and demure, painted face, satin gown, chaste facade. The cruelty of peers taunting our patience until cracks appear, bleed the saccharine queerness of our affectations on the floor. Oh, how they smirk, behind knowing eyes, as if to say no matter how well we pretended they knew a monster lived inside. Pick up the pieces, plaster cracks with indifference. Perhaps if we felt less, we could act righteously. Only when bled, bright purple blood, do we remember a world outside the cerulean sea before our eyes and dream of amber skies. 2. Leave this blue neighborhood, he cried. Maybe in another place we won't die, drying inward like a tide pool left too high, our dreams all crowded on top of each other, anemones and claws, waiting to drown in an ocean of nitrogen. How long must we wait until tides rise, tap feet in impatience, hide the fear, zealously believe fish in an ocean who promise it gets better? Our pools strewn with the bodies of those who pulled themselves on land to try and hear them. Or perhaps we are all fish, dreaming of life under the sky, praying that if we walk and talk like an amphibian, genes would give up evolution's ghost and let us breathe in nitrogen, not die gasping on the sand, sharp ruby gills like a noose in our hand, keeping us from the forests of heaven. Or perhaps the forests in our brain, perceived expectations of sanctity evolved in self-shame, a vestigial organ with no name, the scars of childhood stained upon our neocortex, coloring reality a bright cerulean. 3. In suburbia, churches rarely screen youth leaders for demons who prey on children told to trust them. Abuse, second to preconceived perceptions in a pastor's mind that cause the least problems. Jesus, after all, is the best HR representative. My adolescent heart, a sunbather too close to the tide, like the Big Easy, blue waters pouring in around non-existent levity, every day a hurricane, our city drowning. I am Nehemiah, building Jerusalem's walls, sword and trowel in hand, erecting my mind's city before I am raped again. Perhaps Jonah relished his time in the whale, a religious hibernation, if you will. Entombed beneath 40 tons of flesh, he could rest, contemplate the insanity of running from a god. Maybe he tried to stay within, begging to be left alone in his gastric monastery, clinging to the whale's uvula. I am Ahab, howling from within, steeped in squid bits and bile, raging in the ivory tomb of my memory's abuser, wishing I could crawl from his gullet, cling upon the whale's white hump, and burst my heart's cannon on him. You might have noticed from the reading that in the first part 1 that there's the title of this podcast, Strangers in a Straight Land, which is where I pulled the name for the podcast from. And I think that really personifies what I grew up in middle school and high school experiencing, this idea that I was an outcast. As you've probably already realized from the first episode, there's a lot of religious Christian imagery in my poetry, which makes sense because it was such a large part of my childhood, my early life into adulthood. I still do very much appreciate all the stories and the imagery of the Bible. I think there's some really great lessons in there that a lot of my Christian friends and old friends could do with a little bit of a reminder of. But the first line of Blue Neighborhood is, I think, maybe one of my favorites I have ever written. And it's in reference, of course, to, I think, my favorite science fiction movie, maybe my favorite movie ever, Alien and Aliens. Ridley Scott, in general, I find to be quite compelling director. I say right at the beginning that we wear our masks like face-hugging aliens, praying they will impregnate us. And this idea that we're not just wearing a mask when we're queer in Christian culture, trying to fit in, trying to pretend that we're not who we are, but we are, or at least often when we're doing that, it's not just pretending, it's begging, praying, hoping that by wearing a mask long enough, it will actually change us, that we will become the thing we're pretending I will be. But I think this idea of the face-hugging alien accurately represents that, mainly because there's a very gross rape imagery along with that as well. This idea that, we're inviting this, we're asking for this, but it's not pleasant, it's not happy, and it's not natural or right, and we know that, but we try anyway. Why I think it's one of my favorite lines, because it really, I think, expresses that. Both the need, the desire we feel to change, to be different, to have this alienness, this straightness, or this changing who we are, this idea of being different somehow, the mask, inviting it to rape us, to impregnate us, to change us, and in a sense, in this image, burst out of our chest. And I think that's also why it works, because we know in some way that we'll have to die to have that change happen. It's a really dark image, but I think it's very, very accurate. And I go on through the rest of part one to kind of explore that idea. And it's not just being Christian, or not just in Christian culture that this is talking about, but also the culture of toxic masculinity in North America, which is definitely what I grew up with as well. This idea that boys aren't allowed to cry or feel emotion, or be, quote, sissies or fags or feminine in any way. That the feminine is really derided. And in many ways, queer people, specifically those who are male-bodied, but maybe not specifically gendered male or express all the classic or typical or expected male traits, have to experience toxic masculinity and women hating that society puts on women as well. In a way, it's like we're gender traitors. So many straight men demonize or vilify femininity, both in themselves and other men. And it's weird because while they desire it and sexualize it, it's also not good. That, to be woman is to be weak. Like all these awful images about what femininity means in our culture. Gay men or other queer men or non-binary or trans have to experience this when they are, it's almost worse, because you were born a man. How could you betray, like that privilege in a sense? It's really disgusting in a lot of ways. And it's very hard as a child to have to experience those things from all directions, whether it be from your peers who mock you and make fun of you, to relatives or family members who shame you for expressing emotion. And this can come from men and women, because often, especially in Christian culture, women are just as complicit in this toxic masculinity as men are. In my life, some women have been the most hurtful in the ways that they have shamed my femininity and the ways I experience femininity. As a child, I was homeschooled until middle school, and all the boys were my brother's age. We had a Friday homeschool group where we met and did school things with other homeschoolers, and all the boys were my brother's age, and so I didn't really have male friends then either, and the girls were my age, and that was kind of like the story of my life. And the many of gay or queer men is that, we're left with the girls to play with the girls, and we're in this weird in-between land where I felt like I wasn't a man, because I was told I wasn't, because I was too emotional or too artsy or feminine or whatever it was. But I didn't feel like a woman either. I didn't feel like that was my gender identity. I felt like this weird third middle ground, which now I know and accept and am joyful about, that being queer, this third middle ground gender where I'm, neither really view my gender as fully male or fully female. It's being queer is a specific and different gender experience that I can appreciate both the masculinity and do like to identify as male mostly. But I know I'm not, a cis male like the straight men I grew up with. That is a very different experience, and not that all the cis male masculinity things are bad. It's only evil when they force that on others as absolute or shame those who don't express it in the same way. But I knew I wasn't like that. In any case, this first part of the poem explores that idea too. The idea that you have to wear this mask, this straight mask. You have to pretend not only to be straight, but when I was in middle school, it wasn't even about that. I didn't think I was gay. I just was me. And I knew I was attracted to boys, but it was more about gender identity then. It was more about the fact that I realized I wasn't male. I wasn't masculine enough. I was too feminine, and it wasn't, maybe I did think about it as being gay then because that's what the boys called me. They were like, oh, you're gay, are you gay because blah, blah, blah. And back then I'd be like, no, I just like dance, or I just like writing poetry, or I cry. It's like, it wasn't about sexuality then. It was a gender identity crisis then, crisis that was forced upon me. This, the first part of the poem kind of explores that, there's two parts to this, both the sexual attraction, but also gender identity expression, especially in Christian culture, where there are very, very strict rules that a lot of this culture places upon gender expression and gender identity. So I kind of explore that. The next stanza, I say, we live among them, refugees fleeing Christian wombs, lifetimes spent conforming, endeavoring to not embarrass parents who parade us through church youth groups like a geisha, quiet and demure, painted face, satin gown. And that kind of is exploring how many queer people feel like they don't belong even in their own family. You feel so different, especially when your family may be religious or is particularly conservative and have very strong opinions or feelings about gender expression or sexuality, that you feel like an outcast in your own home. You're a refugee fleeing your own mother. That's a very difficult thing to feel, and that can change, of course, because people don't always have the same views or opinions they always do, and a lot of queer people in their adulthood reconcile with their parents, and their parents learn learn new ways of being and accept them for who they are later. But as a child, sometimes, even our parents, of course, are not perfect because they're people, and they can have biases and opinions that harm us as well, that they may or may not realize are harming us. As children, it's a very difficult thing to both feel like you love and you're dependent upon your family, but also feel like you are separate, wrong, and embarrassing them, that you being gay or you being feminine actually will harm your family and your parents because it'll shame them, because there's such a strong feeling, especially in Christian culture, of shame and gossiping and, oh, did you hear so-and-so, she got pregnant in high school, and everybody gets to feel better about themselves because they get to mock somebody who has a difficult life experience or messed up in some way. That's why I use this kind of imagery of the geisha, which a nice metaphor of this beautiful, put together, this woman studies in schools to be perfectly polite in culture, do everything right, to be the perfect hostess, the perfect musician and entertainer, and to basically express all the 100% what a woman should be, the ultimate epitome of femininity, which I thought was a nice contrast, or at least to the fact that in this I was doing the same thing except trying to pretend I was masculine. I like that, the strong difference there. And then I go on to the next stanza talking about chaste facade, the cruelty of peers taunting our patience until cracks appear and bleed the saccharine queerness of our affectations on the floor. This idea that even though I was trying so hard, putting on the mask, painting my face, doing everything right to fit in or do what I was supposed to do or the way I was supposed to act, it can't hide the fact that I was still super queer, that I was feminine, that I was emotional and cried, and I liked girly, quote-unquote, things. And no matter how hard I was, trying to be manly, it was still so very obvious I was not. my peers would taunt and mock and bully me about that. And it, until it made it get worse, and that emotion comes up, and, the queerness you're trying to hide so strongly comes bleeding out. And then when it does, they get to lord that over you, and I say, oh, how they smirk behind knowing eyes, as if to say, no matter how well we pretended, they knew a monster lived inside. This idea that no matter how hard you try, and you're this kind of futile attempt to be straight, but you can't, no matter what you do, it's impossible. And in the end, how we try to fix that is to stop feeling. That's why I say, we pick up the pieces and plaster cracks with indifference. Perhaps if we felt less, we could act righteously. In part 2, kind of move on from that exploration, and I quote Troye Sivan here in his song Wild, where he says, "Leave this blue neighborhood." I love this imagery that he kind of developed, this idea of the blue neighborhood, because blue has a lot of feelings of sadness or melancholy in our culture. It's a nice imagery of that. And neighborhood is kind of, the childhood neighborhood, the blue neighborhood, this place of sadness that you have to leave, you have to escape, you have to get out of. And a couple points in this poem you'll see I call it the cerulean sea before our eyes, or that you're bleeding purple blood, because everything's colored blue. So even when you breed red blood, it just looks purple, that there's kind of this blue filter on everything. So that kind of led into this sea imagery that I explore in part 2. It is very much is about depression, really, and feeling trapped within this life and this community that we've chatted about, trying to get to the forests of heaven I talk about. But you're a fish, you can't breathe air, you breathe in water. And yet I had a community that told me, you have to do everything you can to get to heaven, to the forests, to live on land, to be something you're not. And then also I bring in, at this point in my life, you start hearing voices from the other side, maybe your liberal friends or pop culture that's saying it's okay to be gay. And I quote the classic YouTube videos and kind of encouragement that they try to send, this idea that it gets better. All these people who are on the other side of things trying to encourage those who are in the worst of it by promising them it will get better. And so that's kind of the picture I create with the second stanza, the idea that we're in tide pools that are drying up. Tide's gone and our pools are evaporating and they feel like they're closing in around us. And we're just waiting for that moment where we'll finally be free. And those promises from the fish in the ocean, I say, who are promising it gets better, we're trying really hard to believe them, even though it seems like it's hopeless. And I say, our pools strewn with the bodies of those who pulled themselves on land to try and hear them. Suicide in this case, you're trying to pull yourself out of this hole or this tide pool to get to heaven, really. And that's when I tie in this idea of faking it or wearing the mask or pretending to be someone else is equal to suicide, really. Because, like I said, I came to a point where I finally realized that if I kept trying to not be gay or pretend to be someone I wasn't, or to cut this part out of myself, I would kill myself eventually. That would just be the inevitable conclusion, because it's so self-destroying. So that's why I say perhaps we're all fish dreaming of being on land, like praying that if we just pretend and we just walk like an amphibian, that somehow who we are will just change, and suddenly we'll be able to be the thing that that they expect us to be, and not die gasping on the sand. I say, sharp ruby gills like a noose in our hand, keeping us from the forests of heaven. I end here again saying that maybe the forest's in our brain, maybe heaven isn't real. Going back to that song by Troye, how can we get to heaven if we deny a part of us, if we kill ourselves, if we destroy everything we are? Like, how is that heaven? And in the end, I say it's all this trauma becomes the scars of childhood, stained upon our neocortex, coloring reality a bright cerulean. So this idea that, tie it all back in the end, that this blue neighborhood, this depression, this sadness, this melancholy that kind of paints our whole life is obviously instructed by all this childhood trauma. And it's, in the end, a pretty vicious cycle. And many people do not come out of it. I don't know if you're aware, but queer people or LGBT people are way higher likelihoods to commit suicide, to experience mental health disorders, to experience other things like substance abuse and addiction. And that is really most likely because, unlike our peers, we have to grow up in many of our families feeling like we are outcasts from our own flesh and blood. And that's what part 2 explores, part 1 and part 2 explore. In part 3, like I mentioned, I go into a very personal experience. And so this is my own personal experience in church. And like I mentioned, I was abused by my small group leader in junior high. And why I talk about this, and I say, in suburbia, churches rarely screen youth leaders for demons who prey on children told to trust them. Because in a lot of Christian circles, people don't believe this kind of thing can happen. That if somebody looks great and says all the right things and wears the right masks and pretends to be righteous and holy and leads worship on Wednesday nights and is likable and charismatic, then how could they ever do anything like this? And that's what happened. I was not believed. I told, our pastor, I told my parents first, and I'm very lucky that my parents believed me immediately and really championed me. But the youth group leaders were not so convinced. And in the end, even though all this happened, nothing happened to this person who abused me. Because he told all my other core group friends that I was, lying and trying to get him fired, and all the parents loved him because he was so charismatic, and he was like the ideal. Like, how could he do anything bad like that? And so, nobody believed the victim in this case, which is unfortunately a sad story that we hear a lot, especially nowadays with the Me Too movement. We know that that's often the case for abusers of others. In the end, how they dealt with the situation was just to move me to a new core group and to make him apologize, which he did by telling me basically, I'm sorry you felt like I hurt you. And they took that as, everything's solved and done. And he still led the small group I was in before. He still led worship on Wednesday nights. And I lost all my friends because they thought I tried to get their favorite core group leader fired and lied about things. And I was left depressed and alone. And Wednesday nights when he led worship, I would feel nauseous and sick, to the point where I couldn't even go to youth group anymore when he did that. And instead of maybe not letting him lead worship anymore or changing something, the youth pastor's decision was just to call us when he was leading worship so I would know not to go that week. And I had to live going to church every Sunday and seeing him constantly. This put me in a very, very dark place, obviously. The end of 8th grade and freshman year of high school was the first major depression of my life. And I almost committed suicide then. But in any case, the part 3 of the poem, I dive into then that experience, the spiral that all this put me in, and I start to bring in this imagery of drowning, that, my adolescent heart. I was a sunbather too close to the tide, or I was the Big Easy, I was Louisiana, blue waters pouring in around non-existent levity, every day a hurricane, our city drowning. This trauma of my life it felt overwhelming, like being tossed to the bottom of the sea. And then I reference a Bible story again, a story of Nehemiah, who was a prophet in the Old Testament, or the Jewish scriptures, who was rebuilding Jerusalem after it was destroyed. He kind of got permission after the Jews, and one of the many times that they were, prisoners in another land, to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild it. But there was lots of opposition. There were enemies around all sides. And so basically they had to rebuild Jerusalem with, in one hand, holding their sword ready to fight, in the other hand, the trowel as they worked. It was this image of just explicit danger and fighting through danger to rebuild. I mean, that's what I felt like, that I was rebuilding my life, my heart, my mind, while being attacked on all sides, afraid of being hurt again. And then I switch again to another story from the Bible, which is probably more common for those who aren't familiar. But Jonah was Jonah and the whale is a pretty popular story. Jonah was forced to go prophesy for God, and he didn't want to because God was telling him to go to this really nasty place where they murdered people for prophesying or whatever. So he tried to run away and took a ship and just fled, even though it's kind of crazy to try and run from God. But he sent a storm, and in the end, they realized, it was him, it was his fault, and so the sailors tossed him off the boat to stop the storm, and he's swallowed by a giant fish or a whale, and, he's in the whale until he finally kind of accepts the fact that he's going to do what God was making him do. So that's the other thing I felt, was you felt like we were being swallowed up by expectations of this life, hurt and the pain. This is also the beginning of the part of my life where I was realizing I was attracted to boys, and that was wrong, or that's what they told me was wrong. And in 8th grade, right after this abuse, we also had this sexuality sermon lecture series where the pastor went through all the naughty, bad bads for all these, pubescent teenagers who are, probably just experiencing sexuality. And so we had talks about how masturbating was wrong, and sex before marriage was wrong, and pornography was wrong. And then, of course, a full sermon about how being gay was wrong. And the pastor even asked people to anonymously talk about how they struggled with this thing so it could feel real or present. And, of course, I was a goody two-shoes and always trying to do what others told me was right. And so I submitted an anonymous thing that said, I struggle with same-sex attraction. And the pastor read my anonymous entry during the sermon day. And I don't know, I just remember feeling both shamed and wrong and hopeful that I could change and be better, and just, felt like Jonah in the whale, that I knew I couldn't run away, that I was going to be trapped. There was no escape. And so eventually you just have to deal with it. And then that leads into this last idea that, this image not only of Jonah in the whale, but now Ahab in the whale. How this prison was not just prison of my sexuality, but also the prison of my abuse, that I felt I was trapped within that trauma. I am Ahab howling from within the ivory tomb of my memory's abuser, that I could not escape it, that this pain or this darkness or this hurt was going to trap me, is what I felt like. And I felt like I was inside, and I say, wishing I could crawl from his gullet and cling upon the whale's white hump and burst my heart's cannon on him. Which, of course, is a reference to Herman Melville's Moby Dick. And the quote from the book is, "He piled upon the whale's white hump the sum of all the general rage and hate felt by his whole race from Adam down, and then, as if his chest had been a mortar, he burst his hot heart's shell upon it." In the end, the trauma of the abuse, it put within my heart a rage, an anger that I think many victims of abuse feel, that not only was the pain the awful thing that was done to you, but that your abuser also has robbed you of a normal life, that they have forever changed you, that you will never be the same and you'll never be okay. And that puts a rage within you, it's an anger that makes you wish you could do the same back to that person, and that's kind of what I expressed there. And so I left my adolescence in middle school into high school with a pretty nasty double whammy of knowing I was gay, or that I was attracted to boys, and the shame and the confusion of that, along with gender identity, all the shame that was placed upon me for my nonconformity to masculinity, as well as this pretty awful abuse I had to experience from a trusted and loved mentor figure. Obviously, that really harmed me for a long time and took away a lot of the relationships I had, because a lot of victims of abuse, you can't let people in anymore. There's a lot of defense mechanisms that your subconscious places around you at that point. We'll probably talk about it in later episodes because I have some poems about it, but this was also the part of my life, unfortunately, where my parents discovered some gay images on the internet browsing history of our computer, and I was sent to therapy for the first time to address that confusion, I think was the way that we talked about it then. And I first had to experience Christian therapy to fix me. This was right after, of course, I had been abused by this trusted youth group leader, so I was in no place to trust anyone. And I went to that therapy and basically hoodwinked the therapist, because I did not trust him, nor was I ready to trust anyone about this. And I basically lied and made him believe that I had some realizations about, oh, I was just looking at these pictures of men because they were handsome and fit, and I felt like I was fat and ugly, and it was just me trying to feel better, and oh, you cured it. Now I understand, and I'm not confused anymore. And he was all proud of himself because he was a PhD candidate. He was doing his clinicals at the Christian university that I was sent to do this with, and he was all like, "Yep, great, fixed it," and then we met with my parents, and he was all like, "Yep, he's good now, all fixed, good job me." He was all proud of himself, and we never talked about it again. Well, at least not until much later. I think this was a good poem to set up future ones, of course, too, because hopefully it really lays out kind of the feeling of what it's like to have to grow up in a culture. For me, it was a very conservative Christian culture, or in a family, or with advisors, mentors, friends, people who viewed you, your nature, your gender expression, and of course sexual identity, which is very, very closely tied to gender expression as well because of toxic masculinity, who views that as alien, as different, as wrong, and how isolating, depressing, and ultimately defeating it is to be that person, to have to wear a mask every day and pretend and try with all your might to be someone else, to act differently, to fit in, to change who you are so that your family, your friends, your community will love you and accept you, and so that you can get into heaven. And how destroying that is, and hopefully that might help you understand why so many of us in the end view that as hopeless and often kill ourselves. So I'm going to end today with a second poem. It's a much shorter one. I won't talk about it, but I think I'll just leave it for you after going through all of that. And it's called Investigation. I do not know what I am looking for. The soul wanders, aimlessly it must seem, bound for where the world holds more generosity. And I have a little hope, and more than that of shame, a world of voices whispering my names into that space between my eye and brain where burdens burrow deep. I do not know what I am looking for until I find it, and when I do, I will sleep. Oh, the most perfect sleep.